Daughter of Darkness and Dreams, The Junning High Chronicles, by Anastasis Blythe. Narrated by Talon David and Ryan Leigh Dunlap. For Penny, with much love and gratitude. Chapter 1. Meiling's heart lurched wildly with the echo of the swinging doors. It took everything to not sprint down the polished granite floor into the throne room and throw herself at her parents. She forced herself to steady her footsteps, to draw herself as tall as she could, and walk with all the dignity of a princess born and bred, as the door attendant announced, "Princess Meiling!" She kept her movements graceful and stately, but inside she was weeping. After traveling across the empire and being kidnapped by brigands, after being imprisoned in Feng Zedong's fortress, she was finally home again. When she lifted her eyes, there was Pa sitting regally on his throne. His legs spread wide against the armrests, and his golden robes glittered in the light streaming through the window ceiling. His clothes seemed to only accentuate his size, and she bit her lip to restrain herself from racing into his wide open arms. She wanted to lose herself in the folds of his robes and hear his gentle coos that everything was all right now. Despite the sheer magnitude and glory of her father, she couldn't help but notice the new lines on his face, the dark circles beneath his lower lashes. His eyes widened at the sight of her, his whole body going suddenly taut. At his right hand, the reedy, long-bearded advisor stood with an upturned chin and flaring nostrils, a tablet and quill in his hands, Meiling's reminder that she wasn't approaching her Pa, but the Imperial Emperor, His Glorious Majesty.
"All dismissed."
Pa's voice rang out before Meiling was even halfway to his throne, commanding and final, despite the edges of emotion.
"Send for Her Majesty the Queen."
As one, the line of warriors along each wall turned and marched through the side doors. The advisor glanced at Pa, and Pa gave him a firm nod. The advisor bowed, took his tablet and quill, and likewise exited the throne room. Meiling kept her steps stately, her head lowered reverently. The sounds of scuffling boots echoed through the golden throne room until the last door closed with a firm, muted thud. And then she was alone with her Pa.
"Meiling."
His raw tone was choked.
"Meiling, my girl."
She couldn't restrain herself anymore. The tears came, swift and salty, and she ran toward those open arms. She didn't run far, because Pa had flown off his throne, scooping her up and hugging her close to his chest. It was like being swallowed whole by affection, and she happily drowned in it. Home, home, home.
"Oh, my sweet girl,"
he murmured, holding her so close she could barely breathe.
"I have never known fear like—"
He trailed off and tightened his grip.
"I'm so sorry. It's my fault. I never should have sent you with so few guardians. I should have suspected that he would find out that you'd fled. I'm so sorry, so sorry."
The imprisonment in Zedong's fortress seemed like a lifetime ago. She wanted to lock away the memories of those dark days and endless nights forever. Still, she could never blame Pa, Shang, or even Fen for what happened. There was only one person to blame. Feng Zedong. "It wasn't your fault," Meiling said, her arms wrapped around her Pa's neck. Before she could continue, a side door opened, and they both looked up as Ma burst in, her mouth open and one hand pressed to her heart. More tears swelled in Meiling's eyes, and then sobs broke loose as Ma picked up her skirts and ran. Pa opened his arms, and then Meiling was nearly suffocated by not one, but two parents. It might have been the best moment of her life. She'd missed them so dearly. They hardly spoke as they held each other. The words were in the air, hovering above them, declarations of love and affection, so many fears, questions, and even a slow-burning anger. Meiling could almost hear the faint echoes of her pa shouting in this very throne room.
"How dare Feng Zedong capture my daughter!"
She didn't want to think about Zedong right now. She'd rather sink into the warmth surrounding her, the familiar smell of pa's robes and ma's spices, the quiet hums of their own tears. Eventually, the reunion was over. Pa dried his wet cheeks as he pulled her into one last embrace, then released her and marched back up to his dais and sat on his throne. Ma stepped to one side of the throne and pulled her face into a serene mask, the one she wore for public events. Meiling dabbed her eyes with her sleeve, staying where she was, facing the throne.
"Advisor Shang!"
Pa boomed, and from the power in his voice, she never could have guessed he'd just been weeping. The door the advisor had disappeared through opened, and the slim man re-entered. With controlled dignity, he took his place at Pa's right hand. Just like that, the entire air in the room shifted. Meiling straightened her spine, falling into her own role as a princess of Junning Hai. The Emperor's guard was not called to return.
"Send them in,"
Pa called toward the great double doors. At once, they swung open by 2 guards on the outside. 3 figures stood on the threshold. The first, a tall, fierce woman with an aggressive stride, wearing robes that could not hide the tone of her muscular frame. It was the first time Meiling had seen her since she'd been lying incapacitated outside of Liafugan. There was stiffness to her movements now, perhaps due to residual pain from her injuries. Hu Fen. The second was another young woman, this one not as tall as Fen, with a willowy form, white academy robes, and quirked mouth. She walked with more of a saunter, her hair loose and long instead of bound. Meiling's one and only true friend, Li Feiyan. The last figure stood between the 2 young women, taller than both by a full head. His dark eyes sparked with their characteristic cunning and calculation, his broad shoulders set, his step purposeful and unfaltering. His handsome face was hard as flint, and his dark hair was pulled back in its typical queue. Instead of deferring his attention to the Emperor, seated before him on his throne, the young warrior's gaze went straight to Meiling's. His penetrating assessment took her in from head to toe, as though reading every thought in her brain. Her stomach flipped despite her best intentions. Tang Shangdi. All was silent except the clicks of their boots on the granite floor until they flanked either side of Meiling. Feiyan to her right, and Shang to her left. Princess though she was, Meiling kneeled with them and pressed her palms and forehead into the floor. Cold seeped into her skin. As the highest rank of the group, she tried to speak, but found her voice hiding behind a series of chokes and half-coughs. "Glorious Emperor," Meiling said. "Honored Queen." The advisor scratched something on his tablet.
"Rise, Princess Meiling."
Pa's voice boomed between the dragon pillars. Meiling lifted her eyes to Pa's and immediately blinked back another traitorous rush of tears. He smiled softly down at her, his eyes warm and filled with emotion. Usually, he would never dare such a sweet smile for her in public. Keeping her emotions in check was going to be much harder than she had anticipated. She stood on shaky limbs. Shang tilted his head slightly her way from where he kneeled on the ground. Was her wobble that obvious? She inhaled quickly, exhaled slowly, hoping to calm herself. She squared her shoulders and met her father's gaze. There was no time to lose control. She would be a dignified princess to honor her father. As much honor as possible for a cursed princess.
"Daughter, we are glad you are returned to us safely,"
Pa said, his tone distant and formal. He glanced back at Ma, who had let a tear escape and run down her cheek.
I am greatly,
he faltered slightly here,
relieved that you are safe and whole.
She bowed her head and outstretched her arms again. This act might be the death of her. Thank you, Majesty.
All rise,
Pa ordered. Together, Fen, Feiyen, and Shang rose to their feet. Shang moved with enough dignity to be a prince, though the same could not be said for Fen's stiff movements or Feiyen's casual posture that communicated the slightest disinterest in rituals. Meiling stood silently with her friends? Comrades? It was tempting to scoot closer to Shang and hope some of his confidence and strength would imbue her. She gritted her teeth and kept her feet planted solidly on the ground. When Pa spoke, it was in his most dictatorial tone.
I require a full report, beginning from the moment the princess was escorted out of the palace until now. Commence.
Whether Shang saw how all eyes turned to him or not, he stepped forward, bowed again, and began. He kept his eyes respectfully lowered from meeting Pa's, his deep voice carrying through the throne room. It was strange to hear the adventures of their first journey described in such bare, emotionless detail. Shang told the story like it was a distant legend of old, robbed of all color and flavor. Fox spirits, phoenixes, dragons, qilins, brigands. Had they truly fought so many Mwagwe? It felt so long ago. He withheld almost any information about Meiling that was not crucial, but he did not hesitate to state outright how they discovered her magic and how she employed it on their journey. Pa held up a hand, and Shang immediately closed his mouth.
Who initiated the investigation into the princess's magic?
I told them, Your Majesty, Meiling interjected quickly, before Shang could incriminate himself for his role. I could not hide it anymore, not after how I was in their minds. The advisor scratched his quill on his tablet. Pa's eyes roved between Meiling and Shang, but did not so much as glance at Fen or Feiyen. He looked back at Ma, who stood nearly emotionless at his side.
Has anyone else heard of this magic?
Only the people standing before you, Majesty, Meiling said. Them and Feng Tserong. She inhaled deeply through her nostrils and met her father's troubled gaze. He was silent for a long moment. She waited, boldly studying his face and trying to ascertain from the various crooks and furrows of his brows what he might be thinking. What did Pa's mind look like? Fen shifted her weight from one foot to the next, keeping her head down. Pa waved his arm for Shang to continue. When Shang reached the part about their attempted and botched rescue of Feiyen, he worded it carefully.
We stumbled upon the brigands keeping the healer Leigh Feiyen captive. We battled them, but were unsuccessful in recovering the healer. So we fled with the princess.
No mention of Fen's insubordinate behavior or Meiling's near capture. Pa interrupted his steady stream of report with a raised hand.
Who decided to attempt a rescue of the healer?
Shang swallowed and glanced down. He lifted his gaze, light reflecting off his dark eyes. Oh no. He intended to take the blame. He opened his mouth, no doubt to save Fen's neck from admitting her fault. Meiling was about to interject that it was at her order, but Fen saved them both. It was I, my lord, Fen said, and bowed low before Pa. Pa tilted up his chin and furrowed his stern brow.
Did you think,
he said deliberately,
that I would not send a force of wielders to recover the healer? Did you think I do not protect my own, especially one as important as the Empire's only healer?
Fen bowed herself to the ground, hands and face planted into the floor. No, glorious Emperor. I beg your mercy. Meiling had never seen Fen so subservient. so docile. It was hard to believe that the one who had been so flippant, so rebellious, so brash, could be this humble. The splendor and majesty of an emperor apparently had this effect. The healer, Meiling heard herself saying softly, was close and suffering under the hard hand of her captors. It was a matter of compassion, glorious emperor. When she lifted her eyes to her paws, he regarded her with tight lips and an expression of, was he wordlessly telling her to be silent? She quickly lowered her eyes, cheeks heating as her shoulders sagged slightly. She swallowed against the biting sting of failure that hounded her every step. Why had she just spoken back to him, in front of his subjects and his advisor? Meiling cursed herself inwardly as the weight of her mother's eyes seemed to penetrate her thoughts. She knew better. It did not matter how close the healer had been or how she had suffered. Shang had been right that their duty to the emperor was to stay focused on their individual mission. Pa waved his hand, and Shang continued the tale with the slightest glance toward Meiling. Of course, he had noted the mute communication between her and her father. For as long as the journey took to live, it took surprisingly little time to summarize. Within a few minutes, Shang reached the terrible part when they'd crested the hill in full view of their destination, only to be ambushed by the brigands that had pursued their trail relentlessly. He held nothing back. Hearing that tragedy falling from his lips, hearing of her own actions to save their lives, it felt like he spoke about someone else. It was not Princess Meiling who stood up to brigands, who offered her life in exchange for her comrades, who had pressed a blade to her own heart as a threat against her enemies. She certainly hadn't felt as brave as Shang made her sound. She'd fought to no avail against Feng Zerong, had not been able to keep herself from being used as a tool to reveal countless secrets to their enemy. In the end, it had been Shang and not her that had been the reason for her escape. Ma's eyes darted back and forth between Shang and Meiling, then down to Fen, who stayed kneeling on the floor. Fen, who had been injured almost beyond recovery. Fen, whose performance on the mission had been not so daring and courageous as Shang's. The shapeshifter stood on far shakier ground than Shang after his brilliant fortress rescue. When Shang finished his tale, he turned to Meiling and Feiyan to tell of their time as prisoners of Feng Zerong. With far less eloquence and a lot more disorder, Meiling explained what she had endured. As much as she wished to hide her failings from her father, she lowered her eyes and told everything she could remember. The breaking of Zuanwan, the mind-hunting, the illusion of her siblings to threaten her. She had not told anyone these things. Not in full. Though he didn't look at her, she was acutely aware of Shang's attention as he listened to the tale of her captivity. He probably didn't approve of her choices. He probably thought she'd acted a fool. Finally, when Meiling had finished, Feiyan had told her part, and Shang had explained his side of the story from sneaking out of Liafugan and joining forces with Lieutenant Jadala to his capture and subsequent rescue of Meiling and Feiyan, all was silent in the Emperor's throne room. Not even the barest shuffle of feet or the rustle of long robes could be heard. For several painfully long minutes, the sounds of Meiling's own soft breathing seemed loud enough to fill the room.
Tang Shang Di. Hu Fen.
Pa leaned forward in his throne toward the two warriors on her left and steepled his fingers. She dared not look at them as they awaited his next words.
You were given an assignment to deliver Princess Meiling safely to the fortress Liafugan, on penalty of death.
Meiling's heart faltered.
I explicitly instructed you that if you failed, your lives were forfeit.
Scratch, 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 went the advisor's quill. No. No, no, no. Had Pa not heard what they'd spoken? Did he not see that they had been outnumbered from the start? That the journey was doomed from its conception? Did he not see how much Shang and Fen had suffered and fought on her behalf? Did he not know that, if not for Meiling's intervention to save their lives, she might have made it to the fortress? Did he not see that her capture was her own choice, not Shang's or Fen's fault? He'd even said it was his fault for not sending more warriors. Meiling blinked rapidly at the floor, betrayal filling her as the advisor's quill clinked against the lip of an inkwell.
Because of this, continued Pa, you will both stand trial starting tomorrow, after the morning parade beginning the Festival of New Lights. 5 days your trial shall run. On the 6th day, the day after the festival is finished, you shall face your verdict and fate.
The blood drained from her face. This had always been their fate, and yet she had hoped. She'd believed her Pa would pardon them somehow, despite that power not falling under his jurisdiction, but that of the courts. Both Fei Yen's and Shang's arms darted out toward her when she staggered slightly, but she stepped forward, ignoring them, and all but collapsed to the ground, prostrate before her father. She bowed with her palms out and face flat against the icy granite. "Glorious Father, please heed my voice," she practically gasped. She pressed her hands into the ground to keep from clenching her fists. Taking a deep breath, she steadied her voice. When she opened her mouth, her words came out less desperate and more composed than before. "These wielders did everything within their power and duty to protect me, even to the point of laying down their—"
And yet it was you, and not them, who was captured.
Pa's voice rang out loud in the throne room, reverberating off granite and marble and glass. Suppressed anger thrummed in those echoes, revealing more of Pa's true feelings than he likely intended. For all he blamed himself for not sending more warriors with her, he was still furious that the warriors he'd charged with her protection had lived while she suffered. Meiling shut her eyes tightly against the burn in her chest. She sucked in more steadying breaths. Her hair fell down her arms on either side of her like a curtain shielding her from whatever reaction the 3 wielders behind her bore on their faces. One more breath, then she spoke softly. "I did it to save their lives."
Speak up, daughter.
His tone was a knife in her chest. She gritted her teeth and repeated louder. "I did it to save their lives, glorious Father. They would have been killed. My life was never at risk."
Your life, perhaps. But think of those who died trying to rescue you from the fortress, and those that will die because of the information our enemy received when you were captured.
Pa's voice grew gentler as he spoke, taking on the informal tone of a father. Still, it bore an edge, betraying his struggle to maintain his lofty, revered distance as emperor in front of the 3 wielders and his chief advisor, while interacting with his daughter.
Meiling,
he said, and her name was like a blow to her face. He's disappointed in me, frustrated with me. She could not bear his disappointment and chastisement. Not after missing him, not while she even now longed to fling herself back into his arms after being separated for so long. Not in front of Shang, Fen, and Fei Yen. A tear squeezed through her tightly clenched eyelids. Her lungs tightened painfully. It was true. She had not considered how saving 2 lives could cost so many more. Even so, she would have done the same thing again. How could she abandon Shang and Fen after all they had done for her? How could she ever leave someone behind to die?
They did not accomplish their mission. They may not be fit for service to the Emperor,
Pa said, resuming his kingly tone.
The courts will decide such.
"Oh no, glorious Father! They are most worthy—" The words spewed too quickly out of Meiling's mouth, and the instant she said them, she shut her eyes and let the fire of a horrendous blush overwhelm her face. Pa said nothing. He should have. He ought to have rebuked her for forgetting her place, for dishonoring him. But he didn't. And somehow that was worse. Still prostrate before him, still with her face pressed to the floor, Meiling sagged. She could say no more. Humiliation drowned her in a torrent so fierce she could think of nothing. Nothing except how she would rather have the entire empire here to witness her impudence than have Shang standing silently behind her. Ma must be shaking her head. Was Fen hiding a smirk? Would Pa punish her later? Would he send for her and issue a thorough private rebuke? Pa addressed everyone.
Publicly, this journey never happened. Princess Meiling was kidnapped from the palace along with the healer Li Feiyan. Tang Shangdi and Hu Fen, you both will serve as temporary instructors at the academy during your trials. The trials will not be public until the conviction. Your appointments are withheld indefinitely unless you are pardoned, but I do not guarantee them to still be available if you are indeed acquitted.
He paused, and Meiling did not know if he eyed Fen and Shang carefully, if he studied her bowed form, or if he glanced back at silent and stately Ma.
You both know the law. If you flee during the trials, you are forever banished from the Empire. You will lose your chance at acquittal, and will be dishonorably executed on sight.
There was another pause. At long last, Pa said firmly,
All dismissed.
All, including Meiling. She lifted her flaming face, but kept her gaze downcast as she slowly rose to her feet. Her eyes betrayed her and snapped to pause. Conflict was heavy in his face, and perhaps a plea for her to understand. To understand what? That he had no choice but to punish innocent people? Something hard formed in her gut. She hoped she never understood that. She couldn't bring herself to look at Ma. Instead, she followed the other three out of the throne room as the Emperor's guard returned with chunking armor and thick boots. When she reached the large double doors, she considered glancing back, seeking just a scrap of the warmth she'd been welcomed home with. Pursing her lips, she kept her attention forward and stepped over the threshold. The doors banged behind her. Life wasn't going to go back to the way it was before her capture, was it? Fen was already storming away. Feiyan and Shang hung back, but somehow it only made her more embarrassed. Shang's back was to her as he watched Fen leave. Before Meiling could look away, Feiyan reached out and hugged her tightly. Emotion built in Meiling's chest, but she restrained it as Feiyan's healing warmth spread through her limbs. I hear work has piled up for me, Feiyan muttered as she pulled away. She rolled her eyes and shrugged. Apparently, people don't stop getting sick when the healer goes on vacation. Come visit sometime if you're in the mood for bodily fluids. It's a little hard for me to get away sometimes. She winked and then strode off down the hallway after Fen. Her white robes moved with her slender form and added a little more breadth to her slightness. Meiling would always envy Feiyan's confidence and strength. Shang's back stayed turned against her as he gripped his wrist behind him with his feet planted wide. She hesitated. He must want to speak with her, otherwise he would have rushed already after Fen and Feiyan. But what could he want to say? The last thing she wanted was his condolences for her humiliation. Oh, how much worse it would be to have him turn, fix those cool black eyes on her, and say,
You lost control of yourself.
Or even worse,
I'm sorry.
Could she slip down the other hallway, away from him? No, he would simply walk after her. Meiling ducked her head and made to walk past him. He said nothing as he slipped into stride with her down the hallway lined with more guards. His robe swished with each purposeful, silent step. She kept her head lowered and clasped her hands tightly before her. Once she stole a glance at him, but his face was set down the hallway and line of guards. This might be worse than verbally acknowledging her error. It burned in the air between them until she was weak with shame. But what could she say? I know I was an idiot in there? Shang sighed. Was it a sigh of pity? Of exasperation? Frustration? She stole another look and was rewarded with the same impassible face and unreadable expression he'd worn the entire journey back from Zerong's fortress. It felt like ages ago that he was warm and open with her. An urge to break into a run and race down the hallways of the palace to her room plucked at her limbs. But she was a princess, and she intended not to embarrass herself any further by forgetting that. They passed the last set of guards. She could breathe a tad bit easier without their witness to her struggle for composure. At last, Shang tilted his head toward her, but did not look at her fully.
Don't try to save me.
His tone was distant, formal. Decorum might be the death of her. Meiling turned away from him, glancing down a corridor they passed as an excuse to avoid facing him. Too soon, she had to pull her eyes forward once more. She wished she could trail her fingers along the beaded curtains lining the wall and listen to their familiar clicking. Wished she could stare with her neck craned backward at the ceiling artwork portraying battles of wielders and moagwe. Wished she could let her eyes feast on the bright colors and be happy to be home. Shang cast a sidelong glance at her when she said nothing. He probably saw every thought that raced through her mind, probably even saw the clenching of her stomach and the dizziness behind her eyes. He lowered his voice, and just maybe there was a layer of feeling in his tone that hadn't been there before.
I mean what I say, Highness. I know you, and I know you will want to intervene. But I would like you to stay out of this. I can save myself. And if I cannot, perhaps the Emperor is right. Perhaps I am unsuited for this work.
Unsuited? Meiling cried, whirling to face him. He met her gaze and cocked an eyebrow. She ignored his expression as her pent-up frustration and hurt gushed out in a stream of words. You are the most capable wielder I know. You are the most principled, honorable, and clever person I know. Fathers, you rescued me on your own. You're smarter than anyone else I've met, and you're so strong and powerful and... When her mind caught up to her words, she clamped her mouth shut and turned away. How many times must she disgrace herself? Was she tired from their journey? Was that why she kept losing control of her mouth? Meiling had never struggled with thinking before she spoke. Of all her siblings, she had been the one who guarded her words best. So why was this trial of Fen's and Shang's what made her tongue come unhinged and speak out of turn? Unfortunately, her earlier embarrassments did not temper the rushing heat to her cheeks. Her breath snagged in her lungs, and she clenched a fistful of long sleeve in her hand. She had stopped walking and wanted to lean against the wall, and perhaps hide behind a curtain. Why could Shang not see that she wanted him to leave her alone? I simply mean, she said, attempting to regain her composure, that you are suitable for the work. Anyone who disagrees is wrong. He stopped behind her, close enough for his warmth to caress her back. Then, so gently she barely felt it, he brushed 2 fingers against her elbow and said softly, Meiling. She did not look back at him.
If I am all of those things,
he continued quietly,
then the judge will let me live. Either way, you should probably meet some other wielders.
The last words were spoken lightly, as if with a smile. Meiling did not need to meet more wielders to know how capable he was. She dragged in a long breath, determinedly set her face, and finally turned around. He remained unreadable, but not so stern as before. He regarded her seriously for a minute, and then he began walking again. She hesitated for a split second before continuing alongside him. Would he die in 7 days? She simply could not think about that, refused to consider the possibility. Surely there was something she could do to prevent it from happening. As though guessing her thoughts, Shang gave her a sidelong glance. If he thought she was going to sit by and let him and Fen die, he was wrong.
Chapter 2. Shang cursed every pair of servant and guard eyes, cursed every inch between him and Meiling. It had been hard enough to keep his distance on the journey back from Feng's fortress, but it was even harder when she was so obviously upset. It went against every instinct to restrain himself, to not comfort her. He'd much rather draw her into his arms and ask her to name every thought and emotion she struggled with now. Instead, he walked beside her, his fingertips buzzing from the barest slip of contact with the sleeve of her elbow. He tried not to look at her too often, lest she sense it. She was still too thin, her skin a ruddier hue from the travel, and while her mouth maintained its sweet tilt, her eyes didn't glow with the same bright innocence they'd once had. Instead, something else sparked there. Something stronger, more defiant, more stubborn. She was different, changed. They both were. The Meiling he'd escorted out of the palace gates would never have spoken back to his Imperial Majesty. For all her flushed embarrassment, Shang liked her better this way. But if he told her he was, in fact, proud of her determination to stand up to anything she perceived as an injustice, he'd only draw attention back to the event that had flustered her. Besides, there were eyes and ears covering this palace from foundation to the tip of the flag flying in the highest tower. Not to mention, he really should keep his distance. He wasn't her bodyguard anymore. He had no claim to her, not to protect her or to comfort her. They weren't in imminent danger now. Not yet, at least. And she wouldn't be cursed to sleep, in need of his kisses to wake. And then there was his potential execution to consider. Shang's gut sank lower, and he ran a hand through his hair. Nothing was guaranteed. The courts could still pardon him, despite the very clear mark against him. But Fen? She wouldn't survive the week without a miracle. A wave of sickness hit him, and he quickly pulled his thoughts back under control. The week wasn't over. Better to savor this moment, walking beside Meiling, this little indulgence in the pleasure the sight of her brought. This could be the last time they spoke, the last time they even saw each other. Did she know it? For just a few more minutes, they were more than nothing. Soon he'd be a wielder on trial for his life, and she'd return to her role as Princess of Jenninghai. They'd have about as much familiarity as he had with the Butagan soldiers he'd killed to save her. It felt wrong, after everything they'd been through together. For now, he stole another glance at her, at the frown she tried to hide, and savored her nearness. Another time, he'd ponder over the wildly odd stipulation of His Imperial Majesty that Shang and Fen spend the week training students at the academy instead of chained in the dungeons. The only valid reason Shang could think of was that the Emperor knew Meiling's capture wasn't truly their fault. They rounded a corner, and he inched closer, opening his mouth. At the other end of the hallway, dressed in academy robes, was a young girl, about 11 or 12 years old. Shang recognized her immediately as Princess Hao. She shared Meiling's same large, expressive eyes. That was the only resemblance between the sisters. Princess Hao took after the harsher features of her father, whereas Meiling was a near replica of her mother. Shang had already instructed Princess Hao here and there at the academy through the years, and she had the wild temperament of a shapeshifter despite her fire magic. The girl's scowl lifted suddenly, and her eyes widened like saucers. She raised her arms, and her long white sleeves flapped like bird wings as she broke into a run. "Mei!" Princess Hao cried. Meiling gasped, and she flung aside her careful posture and controlled elegance, breaking into a run. The two sisters met in a great big hug in the middle of the hallway, Meiling's tear-choked laughter ringing out as she buried her face in her sister's hair. Shang stayed where he was, a storm of emotion swelling inside him as he watched their reunion. She's home. She's safe. She's back with people who love her. She's not mine anymore. Meiling's muffled voice reached him despite the distance. "I'm so glad you're safe, sister." Shang's jaw twitched. He knew why she said that, why she was thinking of Hao's safety at all, because that dragon-cursed Feng had threatened Meiling with illusions of her siblings. Hearing her say that in the throne room, along with so many other horrible things she'd endured in Feng's fortress, had made his blood boil then, and it boiled again now. Feng Zedong wouldn't accept his loss. If Jianninghai didn't prepare its forces properly, Meiling wouldn't be safe from him much longer. "I'm so glad you're back," Hao responded without releasing her bear hug. "They told me you were just sick and could not leave your room or have visitors, but I knew better than that. I knew you left. I'm so happy you're here. Can you come to my arena battle at the end of this week? It's the day after the festival ends." The day Shang could be condemned to death and executed. Meiling froze, as though realizing the same thing, but managed a tight nod. "Of course, Hao. Of course I'll be there." She twisted to look over her shoulder where Shang stood. Her eyes were red and puffy, but it was the spark of determination that concerned him. "Don't get involved, Meiling," he wanted to say yet again. If she wasn't careful, she'd reveal her magic, and then she'd be even worse off than him. She'd sacrificed anything to save him and Fen, and that was what scared him. She'd sacrificed enough. He should leave them to their, "Who's that? I've seen him before," Hao whispered, apparently thinking her voice was quieter than it was, the side of her head pressed against Meiling's chest. "He is very handsome." Well, now he had to stay for Meiling's response. She cast an awkward wince over her shoulder at Shang, and his lips twitched in a barely contained smile. "It's all right. You can agree with her. I won't be mad." Not mad at all. Meiling bit her lip and hugged her sister tighter. Her face pinched as she tried to come up with an answer. She settled on a non-committal, "He went with me." Then she pulled back and frowned. "When did you start noticing boys? I thought they were all gross." Hao giggled. "Maybe not all of them." Fathers spare them from children who decide they're old enough to fall in love. Meiling rolled her eyes and groaned, but smiled anyway. "How was your last battle?" "Oh, Mei, I have to show you what I learned to do." Princess Hao pulled away and stepped back a few paces. Her eyes glittered and her brow furrowed by habit, but she grinned as she raised her arms. "Watch this." "No fire games in the palace." A loud, masculine voice came from further down the corridor. Crown Prince Yun. Shang had stayed too long. He was already slipping down the opposite hallway when the sound of Meiling's gasp and scrambling footsteps reached his ears. The prince's warm laughter followed his quick strides. It was just as well that he didn't get to say goodbye to her. He might have been tempted to say or do something he would regret. Everything had changed in that dark room in Feng's fortress when he'd kissed her again and again. There was no more hiding, no more denying, no more pretending. Shang loved her. He loved her more than he had ever loved anything. And there was nothing he wouldn't give for her to have a chance at freedom and happiness. If it meant he lost his trial, if it meant he and Fen had to die to keep her magic a secret, he wouldn't hesitate. But his death would mean nothing if Feng razed this place shortly thereafter. Shang navigated through the palace complexes, past sets of guards and flurries of working servants. 1 minute inside, breathing the subtly spiced aroma, then outside in courtyards perfumed with the first blooms of bright yellow wintersweet. Then back inside until he finally reached the door nearest the bridge to the academy grounds. He spotted Fen marching down the portico beside the red-painted ornamental railing separating classrooms from the pits where students were almost always practicing combat. She met his gaze and tipped her head, stopping to wait for him to reach her. She should still be resting and recovering, but it was a relief to see her back on her feet again. "Coming to the headmaster to report for duty?" she asked, matching her stride with his. "You go first. I'll be in to report shortly." She glanced at him, a knowing look in her eye, but mercifully didn't ask questions. "I'll let you know how it goes." Shang gave her a nod as they knocked the sides of their fists together in quick, silent camaraderie. Then he peeled off, cutting through one of the boys' empty dormitories to get to Master Dong's office. There was a chance his old mentor wasn't teaching a class. Shang reached the familiar wooden door in the corridor of offices and knocked. A firm, decisive sound. "Not now," called the voice from inside. Shang turned the latch and pushed open the door. "I said not—" "Shang-Di! By the fathers!" Master Dong, a portly man with a shaved head, immediately set down his quill on the short desk he sat before. He leaned back on his heels, his gaze sharpening as it ran over Shang from head to toe, taking in his travel-worn appearance. Shang shut the door behind him. "I need to speak with you about Feng Zedong."
Chapter 3. Meiling could hardly believe it was her brother grinning at her. She tripped as she scrambled into a run, leaving Hao whining behind. She flung herself into Yoon's broad arms and he laughed, hugging her back, though not near as crushing as Hao had, while she swallowed more tears. They would only make Yoon uncomfortable. Instead, she grinned like an idiot and refused to let go when he stepped backward. He is safe. And she was home. "Enough, enough!" he cried, reaching behind him to unwind her arms from around his waist. "You're too clingy for a princess, sister." "Are you happy to see me?" She beamed up at him, her grin taking on a mischievous glint as he pried away from her grip. He was dressed in academy student robes, but his were more rumpled and dirtier than Hao's. His top knot was falling, and a few rebellious strands stuck out at ridiculous angles. His eyes shone with an alertness that she recognized from her travels with Shang and Fen. "Who were you battling just now?" Meiling smiled and reached up on tiptoes to tug a few of his wildest strands back. Yoon batted away her hand with a cringe. "Only a feral wielder." "Then why are you so tousled?" He glared at her, and she burst into laughter. Hao came running up behind them and flung her arms around Meiling's waist. "I'm so glad you're back!" "Where did you go?" Yoon asked with a frown. He folded his arms across his chest and leaned back against the wall in his typical attempt at overconfidence. Meiling pursed her lips and shrugged. Long story. How did you both get away from the academy for so long?
I finished my battle. They gave me a break and Ma sent a servant telling me you were better.
He rolled his eyes and spread his mouth in a wide, thin line.
Said I should come say hello.
I'm glad you did. For a moment, they were back to the carefree relationship they used to have, before pesky things like curses and magic invaded the simplicity. They turned to Hao for her explanation. She narrowed her eyes, her lips pulling back in something that might be a grin or a snarl. Planting a hand on her skinny hip, she faced them. How I got away is none of your business.
How?
Yoon exclaimed, face suddenly serious.
Did you sneak out of your lessons again? Do you want to get sent to detention?
I'm a princess. They can't send me to detention. Hao returned flippantly, tossing her hair over her shoulder and fixing Yoon with a pouting glare. Besides, it was so boring. When will I ever need to know who all the guardians are? Meiling met Yoon's eye over Hao's head. He looked momentarily at a loss, but turned back down to Hao, frowning sternly.
Back to class, sister,
he said, and pointed down the corridor.
Before you get in too much trouble.
Hao rolled her eyes and hugged Meiling again. You cannot tell me what to do. Meiling closed her eyes and smiled. Then she drew herself up seriously and pushed Hao away with a firm grip on her shoulders. Our brother is right. You ought to go back. It's not a good appearance to have the princess disregarding her studies. Hao stared up at Meiling for a long moment, as though testing if she was serious. Evidently, she determined she meant her words. She sighed like she was a long-suffering martyr. Then she puffed the hair out of her face and raised a hand in a disinterested farewell as she moped off to her studies. Meiling bit back a grin and turned her attention to Yoon. He pushed away from the wall, rattling the beading on the tapestry of Junning High countryside as he did so.
I should follow,
he said, nodding after Hao's retreating form.
But I'm happy you are back and safe. If anything had happened to you, I would have personally hunted down every last offender and burned them to a crisp.
She laughed and rubbed her arms. I have no doubt. You'll have to tell me everything that happened at the academy while I was gone. He started nodding and continued nodding, as if he didn't know what to say next.
Well, I suppose. I'll see you tomorrow. For the parade.
He surprised them both by reaching out, grabbing her shoulders, and leaning in to kiss her quickly on the cheek. He cleared his throat and strode down the corridor without a word. Meiling stared after him, lips parted in surprise and heart ready to burst. A little curl of smoke escaped Yoon's hand, but he quickly suppressed it. So, he was just as happy to see her as she was him. Had he ever kissed her? Likely not, since she was a baby. Meiling stared after his departing form much longer than necessary and reached up to touch her cheek softly.
Feng has armies, Shang said urgently, keeping his voice low as he pointed to the map Master Dong had spread across his desk. Both forces from Butagan and an entire brigand army. Who leads the brigand army? Said Master Dong, serving 2 cups of tea they both promptly ignored. Shi Young. I saw him at Feng's fortress when they took me to and from the dungeon. I couldn't confirm what networks were involved, but I know for a fact that a significant amount of them were hidden ones. The only tattoos I saw were 9-tailed foxes. I knew that Shi family was leading the hidden ones, Master Dong growled. I just couldn't prove it. No one could. Not even Lieutenant Jadala, and he's been dogging their trail for over a decade now. Every time we captured a brigand, someone broke them out before they could be questioned, It didn't matter if guards were posted, by morning they were always gone. It was nearly impossible to track down an evanescer committing a crime, much less an entire family of them. But Shang had a suspicion about who'd been breaking them out of the Suguan incarceration unit. Young's younger brother, Shikai, who enjoyed pretending to be a worthless idiot. Shang had never liked either Shi-san, and he didn't have proof beyond a few notable instances of Kai's absence. I don't know which members of the family are involved, but Young seems to be the only one at the fortress. The younger one better not be involved, said Master Deng with a rueful twist of his lips, since he's in the Secret Service. Shang had just taken a sip of tea and nearly spat it back out. What? Kai is in the Secret Service. He and 2 others, Lien Delan, one of the more reliable investigators in the Secret Service, and another fresh graduate, Sun Aranya, were instrumental in proving the trail of the missing wielders did, indeed, trace back to Fang. Sun Aranya, the partial shapeshifter? Shang could hardly believe his ears. He made it his business to know every graduate in his year and their appointments, had worked hard to learn the names and abilities of every student at the academy. She was assigned to Tsushui as a warden. What do you mean she is in the secret services? Master Deng lifted both hands and shook his head. Something strange happened. I haven't been able to figure out what, but word has it they were part of the sacking of Fang's fortress following your escape along with Jadala's forces. He wasn't going to waste more time on the partial shapeshifter. She wasn't the pressing concern here. His inclination was to be skeptical of Shikai's loyalty, but as he turned the facts over in his mind, he couldn't come up with a reason why Kai would directly contribute to a major defeat of his benefactor unless he wasn't actually involved in Shi Young's schemes. So, Kai might be a traitor, but it doesn't seem to be the case, Master Deng finished. Fang's fortress fell to Zhenninghai only 4 days after your rescue. Because Meiling freed those phoenixes. Shang buried the warm burst of pride in his chest. But most of his forces weren't even stationed there. He tapped his finger on the map, then trailed it between the mountain markings. He could regroup at this fortress to the east, and this pass goes straight to Suguan, said Master Deng, his face grim. Shang worked his jaw, hoping he was wrong, knowing he wasn't. It's almost as if he wanted this fortress to fall, to lull us into a false sense of victory while he's already prepared his escape plan, which puts him in an even better position to attack. Master Deng studied the map quietly for several long minutes. His years as one of Zhenninghai's top military strategists were obvious from the keen light in his eyes. Those eyes snapped up, pinning Shang in place. Does he have enough strength to take the city, from what you've seen? Shang ran a hand through his hair, gritting his teeth. He could take all of Zhenninghai. We don't have the manpower. Not since we only employ wielders in our military. Our forces are specialized. Based on what I saw in his fortress, combined with the intelligence you've heard, it's obvious he outnumbers our military 5-1. Even if powerful magic isn't common in Butagan, some of those soldiers will have magic. They won't be trained like they would have if they'd been raised in Zhenninghai at the academy, but it's another element of surprise against our soldiers. We need to do something or our home is gone. But you can't do anything. Not while you're on trial. Ice ran along Shang's skin, his sense of the air's moisture prickling in response as his hands turned cold. If I do nothing, this place is going to burn, and Meiling with it.
Chapter 4. The evening was alight in dying fire. Meiling pulled her shawl around her nightclothes as she stood by her window, staring out at the sprawling city as it swallowed the ocean shoreline. Midnight darkness crept up from the horizon to envelop her, and the little pinpricks of torchlight flickered to life in the city. How long had it been since she last stood here? Over 2 months. She leaned forward on the sill, sticking her face out into the stiff wind. Tomorrow was the first day of the Festival of New Lights, but to her, celebration seemed impossible. It felt like a facade, a pretty lie to soothe them all to sleep. She sighed and slouched against the stonework. Her cheek brushed against the heavier curtains she should probably draw closed to keep out the chill. She did not care what Shang said. She would do whatever she could to save him and Fen. After all, was she not a princess? Surely there was something she could do to help. Any unbiased court should see that they had not set out with enough wielders for their journey. In the chance that this trial went south, she intended to intervene as necessary. Her maids had left not long ago to stand outside her room until after dark, awaiting her beck and call. At this moment, she heard the shuffling of their bows and murmurs of deference. Ma must be coming. A conglomerate of anger, humiliation, and exquisite joy battled for ascendancy in her mind. Her fingernails dug against her windowsill, her knees locking up tightly. She held still and did not turn as the door opened and silk rustled. The door closed. The rustling stopped. "Meiling," Ma whispered. Tears choked her voice. Meiling could not bear it any longer. She whirled and ran to embrace her mother. They held each other tightly, and their tears mingled in a wet, salty mess across their faces. It was this morning all over again. Eventually, Meiling pulled away and stepped toward her bed. Like she had done 1,000 times before, she slid onto the firm surface and pulled the quilt up to her chin. Ma sat near her feet, and by habit, her hand reached out to trace along the fabric. "I have an idea to help the war," Meiling blurted. Ma's eyes shot up, and a frown puckered her beautiful features. "War? My dove, you must not concern yourself with the war. Your father has been meeting with his strategists much of the day for that purpose. You're safe now. If you want to talk about anything that happened, I'm here." Meiling did not want to rehash anything. Not her journey, her captivity, and certainly not this morning in the throne room. She wanted to move forward, and she knew things about Zedong that no one else knew. As you heard earlier, when Feng Zedong imprisoned me, at those words, Ma looked away. Meiling shut her mouth, instead studying her mother's profile and clenched jaw. Her puckered brow. The mingling of fierce anger and sorrow. He actually meant something to her. Perhaps not romantically, but Zedong's affection had not been as entirely one-sided as she had originally expected. The thought made her heart clench painfully, and she ripped her eyes away from her mother and stared down at her hand squeezing the edge of the quilt. She didn't want to think of Ma caring about someone who had tortured and tormented her. He used my magic to hunt through prisoners' minds and give him information about the Empire that he could use against us. Meiling continued without looking up at Ma. I could do the same here. Any prisoners, or even people who are not prisoners, but who might be withholding secrets from the Empire, I could infiltrate their minds. I can do it stealthily. No one would know. She could have cut the shock of that silence with a knife. "Mei," Ma said with quiet fire. "You cannot help the war. Your magic is unsanctioned." "Cannot Pa sanction it? Grant me an honorary title?" Meiling pressed. "I know I could help. There are so many things I could do that could aid the Empire in the war. Even scouting for Tsadong's brigands. Ma shook her head, and Meiling's chest constricted in dread. Your father cannot sanction your magic, my love. It is too late. To do so would incriminate him of treason against the Empire. You understand what would happen, Mei. Our entire family would be executed. Meiling flung back the covers and shot to her feet, striding to her window and thunking her elbows down on the sill. Then why was this not sanctioned years ago? When I could have learned to use my magic, gone to the academy, and not lived this chilling cursed life of a cursed princess? Lu Meiling, your language, Ma rebuked sharply. Control your temper. Ma had never told her to control her temper. That rebuke was saved for her two fiery siblings. Meiling sagged, the edge dissipating off her anger, but not entirely. She still had many questions she needed answered. Why could she not have been a fire wielder like Hao and Yun and Pa, or even a low magic seer like Ma? Anything but what she was. She turned around to face Ma. In an even tone, she asked, "Why is my magic a secret? Why would you and Pa make me keep a secret that could destroy our entire family? A secret that is bound to come out eventually." Ma's gaze sparked with that subtle ferocity. Do you know what happens to wielders with your kind of power? Exactly what happened to you in Tsadong's fortress. You find yourself asleep for your entire life, and you are little more than a slave to the Empire. And what if your power falls into the wrong hands, like it did? That level of power equips tyrants to become the terrifying rulers they are. We were protecting you, but not only you. Meiling fell silent. She thought of Fei Yen, who had, in some ways, preferred her captivity. Ma's voice quieted. You think you are the only wielder in the Empire who keeps their magic a secret. Do you know one of the reasons healers are so rare? Surely Ma wasn't implying. Are there more healers besides Li Feiyan? Meiling asked, incredulous. Ma shrugged and drew her knees up onto the bed. There is evidence to suggest there might even be entire lineages of healers who have kept their magic secret for hundreds of years. The only healers, then, are the random ones that seem to come out of nowhere. Their parents, excited to have such a powerful wielder, immediately send them to the academy. And then they end up like Fei Yen, little more than a commodity. Meiling shifted her weight to raise her hand and rub the bridge of her nose. All this time, she had misunderstood so many things. We did not want that life for you, Ma said softly. You know we would give anything to offer you more than life as a cursed princess. But we wanted you to live your life rather than be chained away in the dark. We wanted you to experience life, love, a family, freedom. Things you could never have as a wielder. Several sharp remarks crossed Meiling's mind. Remarks about how difficult it was to find love when everyone believed her curse. How she wanted more from life than redeeming her shame through children. But she could not bring herself to say any of them, as a picture suddenly flashed through her mind. She saw herself sitting here, her arms full of a cooing bundle. Instead of Ma perched on the end of her bed, it was Shang. Tall, long-legged, handsome, grinning down at a toddler in his lap. She saw him look up at her, and the image of that smile and the happiness on his face was enough to make her insides turn to water. Meiling pivoted on her elbow so she could stare out the window, away from Ma's knowing eyes, away from that image that was forever impossible, especially if he was executed in a few days. So, my magic must remain a secret I carry to my grave. Meiling said at long last. Not only for my sake, but for my entire family's sake.
Yes.
This is why I cannot help fight Sarong. Why I cannot use my magic to help defeat the one who imprisoned and tortured me. Silence. Then, a hesitant and trembling, yes. Meiling left her window and climbed back onto her bed. For a long minute, she met her mother's gaze and saw so many things that terrified her. The implications of this reached farther than she could even imagine. She would forever be viewed as cursed, to her dying day. She could never, ever be herself. Her very existence was a lie she and her dearest loves could die for. Shang, Fen, and Feiyan all knew her secret. Their silence was treason. They could be executed too. She would never be seen, never understood. And if she was, it would cost her everything. Ma stood, her fingers lingering only for a second on the quilt. Your father is doing everything he can to protect you. He will keep you safe. Please do not concern yourself with the matter. You've been through so much, and you need time to rest. Think instead of the festival this week. I know you love the fireworks. Meiling nodded, tight-lipped. Ma bent forward and planted a soft kiss on Meiling's forehead. As she did, a shuddering breath escaped her, and a tear landed on Meiling's nose. I am so relieved you are home safely, my love. Me too, Meiling said, as she wiped away Ma's tear from dripping off her nose, then hugged the quilt with both hands under her chin. Ma rose, made her way to the door, but stopped with her hand on the handle. She looked back, as though knowing Meiling wasn't placated, as though knowing there was a mountain resting on her shoulders that she couldn't move. Suddenly, Ma's eyes flew wide. Her brown irises twisted. Purple light flared out of her eyes, straight toward Meiling. Ma! Meiling leaped out of her bed and rushed to her side just as she collapsed against the wall. Ma! Ma! She slid her arm under Ma's shoulders and heaved her toward the bed. As she did so, Ma began struggling violently. Her limbs flailed, fighting Meiling's hold. Maids! Meiling screamed. Hurry! Help the queen! The door burst open. Maids rushed forward just as Ma twisted and swiped her nails at Meiling's face, only barely missing. The purple light faded until only her eyes glowed that strange hue, but her face was devoid of her own personality and consciousness. To the bed! Meiling shouted as maids circled her and grabbed at Ma's floundering limbs. Carefully, they laid her on her back as Meiling ordered them to hold her down so she didn't hurt herself. Her heart threatened to beat straight out of her chest. A scream tore free of Ma's throat. Those doe-like eyes were white-ringed and unseeing, filled with purple. Her mouth hung open and her body writhed under the restraint of half a dozen maids. Her head swung wildly from side to side. Meiling had heard the stories of visions coming over seers, but in all her life she had never seen one happen. It was far more frightening than she had imagined. It's all right, Ma, she said through gritted teeth as she held down Ma's surprisingly strong left arm. It's all right. After an eternity of thrashing, the purple light finally faded from her eyes. Ma, Meiling gasped, tentatively releasing her grip on her arm. Ma, it's me, your daughter. Ma blinked rapidly, and her eyes swiveled in their sockets to Meiling. My dove. Her voice quavered sharply.
All dismissed!
A loud voice boomed from the door. Meiling straightened as Pa stormed into the room through a flood of ducking and bobbing maids. After slamming the door shut, he ran to kneel by Ma's side.
Lena,
He asked, his voice breaking slightly.
can you hear me?
Ma rolled her eyes over to him, smiled, and nodded. Yes, I can hear you. Pa spewed a sigh of relief and gripped Ma's hand.
I came as soon as the servants said you were having a vision. I'm so sorry I wasn't here when it started.
No need, Ma whispered quietly through a scratchy throat. Meiling handled it very well. Pa looked up from Ma to Meiling, and his face melted from strain to pride. Gone was the tension from earlier. He smiled at her and reached across the bed to squeeze her shoulder.
My good girl.
Meiling ducked her head and nodded mutely. She returned her attention to Ma, who endeavored to sit against the bed frame. Pa eased her up, making her look uncharacteristically frail. She quickly came back to herself, however, which made Meiling's rapidly pounding heart slowly ease. Pa's mouth was tight, but he smiled at Ma anyway, perhaps to comfort her. He kept his hand on Ma's, and his thumb was busy stroking her knuckles. What was your vision? Meiling asked. Ma turned her head from Pa to Meiling, and when their eyes locked, her lips parted and a gray cast fell over her skin. She pressed a hand to her stomach. Niansu, Pa yanked off his cloak, stuffed it in Ma's lap, and rubbed her back as she leaned forward and retched. His attention flicked to Meiling, and the look sent a sharp bolt of worry through her. He called for the maids to return. They hurried in with more bows as he wrapped up the soiled cloak and ordered them to change the bedclothes, just to be safe. Then he eased his arm behind Ma's back to lift her upward into a sitting position. Ma glanced at Meiling and almost immediately bent over and dry-heaved. Somehow, Meiling knew this wasn't a normal part of having visions. Pa bent down and swiftly scooped Ma up into his arms. He looked just as alarmed as Meiling felt. At the same time, he and Meiling both opened their mouths. She immediately shut hers, her eyes falling from Pa's to the long streaming of Ma's silk robes hanging to the floor.
She will be fine shortly.
He nodded at Meiling, his face softening just slightly.
I love you. I would have burned this whole world down to get you back safely.
Then, looking down at Ma in his arms, he strode out of the room as servants opened the door for him. They shut it behind him and barely avoided snagging Ma's shawl in the process. Once her maids had made quick work of changing the bedclothes, Meiling fell heavily upon her bed and laid in stunned stillness for a long while. That had been fear in Ma's eyes. Ma was never afraid. Did she see something about Sarong? Something about him taking the city? About him taking her captive again? Meiling's gut roiled at each new idea until she was so sick, she nearly retched onto her new quilt.